Welcome back to Language of the Soul, conversations on healing and growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
Well, Martin, we've got some very cool happenings at Simplicity Farm and virtually for our listeners to join in on. The movie club that we did over the summer was so much fun, and we got such a positive response from everybody who joined you at Simplicity and virtually for the discussions that we asked, should we keep doing it? The answer was an enthusiastic yes. So as of right now, we have started that back up. We just had our screening for My Octopus Teacher back at the beginning of October. This is the way that it's going to work. Every first Sunday of the month, you can go and visit Martin at Simplicity Farm if you're local to Maryland, DC, Virginia area, or you can watch the movie on your own. And then every first Thursday of the month, you'll be able to join via Zoom at 7 p.m. Eastern to discuss the film. The next film coming up on November 3rd is Perfect Days from Wim Wenders. And then on December 1st, we've got Origin, directed by Ava DuVernay. And then moving into January 2025, it's Inside Out 2, which you may have already seen, the biggest movie of the year, right? February 2nd, we're continuing our watch of the Three Colors trilogy with the second in the series, Three Colors White. And that's from Krzysztof Kieslowski, the Polish auteur. Then in March 2nd, we're going to a supreme classic from Charlie Chaplin. It's Modern Times. But Martin, I wanted to touch base on the next film, Wim Wenders' Perfect Days, because that was something you had recently seen, had been excited to see, just knew that this was going to be a movie that resonated with you. And it truly did.
Absolutely. Perfect Days was everything that I hoped it would be, and frankly, more. It was extraordinary in its ability to convey feeling as well as experience with, frankly, very little dialogue. And while often people say, well, without dialogue, what's happening? How would you even know what's going along in the story? And yet, it's done so well and so beautifully that you're left with this experience of Hirayama's world, because that's the main character's name, Hirayama. And you're left not just with his outer world, but also with his inner world. And it's just so beautifully done. And one, for those of you who are concerned about movies that are subtitled, it's frankly a non-factor because the movie moves in ways that the dialogue, while yes, it's subtitled, it frankly doesn't matter. You don't even need to, you could turn the subtitles off and the movie would convey all its essence without ever needing to know even what was being said through the dialogue. I'm not saying do that, I'm saying you could.
Well, what is that essence?
Well, the title says it to some degree. We learn so much about the main character and his world and his life, in large measure because of what's not said.
I see.
What we, in essence, what he doesn't respond to, what he doesn't choose to engage with. And in large measure, we hear this expression amongst writers and other creatives around the notion of world building. And Hirayama, in many ways, is a very lovely internal version of a very interesting world he's created. And there's admiration for the world he's created that I feel inside. There's also, I feel, by virtue of the nature of the work that I do, as someone who writes, who does a podcast, who teaches, who practices acupuncture, in many ways, I have created my own creative world. That's a little different than Hirayama's in the sense that it's a great deal more interactive, but it's also very, very, very deeply internal. And it's kind of a lovely segue into the topic that I want to touch upon today, which is the concept of I don't know. This idea that in our world, it's often seen as not okay, not to know, not to have an answer.
Anxiety inducing.
It's anxiety inducing, right? And, people can respond, I don't know, because they're in some ways fearful. They're afraid.
Right.
People can express, I don't know, out of frustration, right? I don't know. It's a defensive mechanism. I don't know, right? It can also be an expression of not knowing one's own inner landscape, which is often the anxiety or worrisome trend of the process. They're all kind of expressions of, to some degree, not feeling like you know what you should know, rather than the empowerment, the potence of I don't know. The recognition that I don't know is a form of being curious, of not
Right.
having concretized what you think you know, being open to a new possibility. And instead of seeing it as an imperfection of self, actually seeing it as the empowering truth that it can be if you embrace it. And I want to emphasize that word embrace. I don't know. Own. I don't know. Whether it's an answer someone else wants to know, it's an answer you want to know. Be curious, be open, be willing not to know, whether you're talking to your boss, whether you're talking to your partner, your children, the world at large. I don't know. If you don't have an answer, accept that you don't have an answer in those moments. And in many ways, let me say, in some ways, in the movie Perfect Days, Hirayama embraces that. And the result is a joy that we experience in his presence, because he's not carrying around the tension of needing to know how many facets of the modern world operate. And I don't want to take too much away from your viewing of the movie if you do choose to watch it. So I'm going to say nothing more about the character Hirayama other than he has a very unique perspective on the modern world and the elements that he chooses or doesn't choose to embrace as meaningful and important to him. And I personally love that. I love the idea that we can pick and choose what elements of life and that we don't have to know. And while this may surprise people because here we are, we're on a podcast. I embrace largely most new technologies, and yet at the same time, should we automatically embrace all that? And that's only an element of it.
So, what you're talking about with choosing how to engage with the world around you and that sense, it reminds me of when you told me stories about your time in Bali as a young man and the people of Bali, how they adopted all sorts of different pieces of various beliefs in order to make something that worked for them. And it was this beautiful kaleidoscope of beliefs.
Right. So what happens in a place like Bali, an island that is constantly over the centuries, people arriving by boat of different ethnicities, different religious beliefs, different social structures, is each group, whether they be Christian or Muslims or ethnically Chinese or Indo-European, what in essence happened is the Balinese embraced it, took the pieces they chose that felt true to them, and they kept doing what they were doing. And so, what that led to, at least as of a few decades ago when I was last in Bali, and from what I understand from other people, it's largely intact, is the Balinese in many ways kept their animistic roots and then brought in a little bit of Christianity, a little bit of Islam, a little bit of Hinduism. They brought it all in and they just said yes. At the same time, creating a kind of monochromatic picture. They were willing
Ah,
to say, "Oh, there's no reason why the larger picture of belief, whatever that belief, is, there's truth there. It's not a truth that precludes another belief. It's just a belief from their perspective." And kind of segueing from that, I recently rewatched Ted Lasso. People who have seen the TV show, a central theme within the storytelling is this notion of believing in oneself, believing in others, embracing through trials and tribulations the notion of being willing to, in many ways, embrace who we are, make mistakes, and as Ted often says throughout the 3 seasons of the show, be a goldfish. And what he means by being a goldfish is don't carry your failures around with you. Be willing to fail, let it go, and move on to the next day. And from my perspective, I don't know, and the notion of belief are deeply connected that way. We have to be willing to let our beliefs be shattered over and over and over again. Our beliefs about ourselves, our beliefs about our relationships, about the structural order of life, all of it. We need to be willing to hone that in such a way that it ultimately fosters in us a faith. Not a faith in someone or something else, but a faith in ourselves, a knowing of ourselves. And I would offer that in many ways, the irony of what I'm describing is that the faith I'm speaking of largely begins and is anchored in some ways by a willingness to embrace the idea of not knowing. And in doing so, being curious, being resilient, and being a goldfish, and ultimately finding new answers. And as those new answers come along, being willing to embrace the elements of those, right? Like the Balinese were over centuries, centuries and centuries. New crusaders, new conquerors came along, and the Balinese said, okay, we'll try some of this. And they did. And the result is this, in essence, this island of incredible, extraordinary, largely joyful people.
It really does come back to belief in oneself and community and knowing that those things will change, those things will grow, those things will heal, they'll morph, which of course brings me back to Movie Club. If you're intrigued by what we have lined up, you can go on over to the upcoming events page at martinperkins.com, martinperkins.com, and you'll see a post for a free movie club, and that's got all the details in there. And you can RSVP for all of them and just let Martin know if you only plan on attending some of them. But I would encourage, with a curious wink and nod to you all, do consider watching all the films. There is a curatorial process that we've put into this here. There is a flow. There is something very powerful about showing up each month to share in the same story with a group of people and to see how that builds and plays off of the previous ones, how that changes your beliefs and even affirms those moments when you feel like you don't know.